global optimism is just my attitude toward life, and it's an optimism that I hope will be more and more contagious, because despite evidence to the contrary, we actually do have increasing reason for optimism coming from the increasing numbers of people who are committed to dealing with complexity and to dealing with deep issues. I think what was paramount after Copenhagen was first the conviction that we could not accept defeat as the final result. Yes, there was a defeat, but I interpret defeat as a challenge, not as the final result. And it's the challenge to then see beyond today's reality to the vision of the tomorrow that we can construct and that we must construct. And it was very evident that climate change, being a global problem, requiring a global solution, needed a global agreement. And just because it wasn't possible at one time under certain circumstances does not mean that it is not possible ever under any circumstances. So it was a question of figuring out, how does this become possible? How do you construct the pathway, and how do you construct the alliances and the buy-in and the interest and the momentum to get to a global agreement, which is the work that we did over 6 years. I have always thought that the work on climate change, complex as it is and important and critical as it is on its own, is actually, without diminishing the impact of climate change work, is honestly a playground. It's a playground where humanity is learning to, or perhaps a better analogy would be a gym. It is humanity's gym to strengthen our muscle on how do we deal with global challenges, how do we deal with differences, how do we deal with listening to each other, how do we deal with collaborating across divides, because we must, how do we deal cross-sectorally. And we have learned an awful lot in the preparation and in the negotiation and in the architecture of the Paris Agreement. It's not just how the agreement itself, the product itself, it was the process, the collaborative and collective process of preparing the rationale and the logic of the Paris Agreement that was perhaps even as important or more so than the Paris Agreement as a result itself. And there are many lessons to be learned there about how do we deal with differences and how do we move forward in full respect of diversity, but along a common path that is able to bring everyone on board. So I do think that we will still, for years to come, be deriving lessons from the process that led to the Paris Agreement for many other issues that are only tangentially related to climate change. You know, the wonderful thing about the Paris Agreement is that there is no one single factor that led to success. If that had been the case, it would be too fragile an agreement. The reason why this agreement is so well founded and has such a solid basis that it cannot be derailed by one country or no matter what the size, is that there were many, many, many factors that led to success. So yes, the United States and China agreements, because there were 3 bilateral agreements between the 2 of them, were certainly a contributing factor, but not the only one. There were bilateral agreements that crisscrossed the world everywhere between Latin American countries and European countries, between Asian countries and Europeans, between Asians and Latin Americans. And you know, there were bilateral agreements that crisscrossed and helped to build a network of bilateral agreements. Then there was the participation of the private sector that was very, very adamant once they understood why this is in their own interest. Very, very adamant about the need to move to a decarbonized economy. There was the support of labor unions who understand that on a dead planet there are no jobs, and that in order to increase jobs, we need to move to new technologies that actually increase opportunities for employment, not decrease. Data point, there are 75,000 jobs in coal in the United States. There are 2 million jobs in renewable energy, just to understand what the opportunities are. There was the support from the financial sector, and there was the support even from the spiritual and religious community. So across the board, to say nothing about the support from science, from women's movements, there was an overwhelming groundswell of support for this agreement, and that is why this agreement will stand firm. Yes, I visited many countries. I haven't actually had time to sit down and count how many countries, but I must have been in at least 100 countries, and certainly was in China several times, because that was my responsibility, because my responsibility was to ensure that every country had the space to express itself and to understand where they could contribute out of their own national interest, out of their own vision for their own economic and social development plans. And so that was the reason why I personally visited all of these countries, because the reality is completely unique in every single country. You can't assume that the reality of country A is the same reality of country B. It never is. Every single country is unique, and in fact, every single area in each country is also unique. Scientists have also said that there could be a possibility that we may have been already into the third year of having flattened out on greenhouse gas emissions. We don't know if that is actually a long-term trend or if that is just a 3-year hiatus. We don't know that yet, and we have to wait to see. But what is very clear is that even if this is a 3-year path that then denotes a flattening of emissions, flattening emissions is not enough. We have to descend and decrease emissions, and we have to do it as quickly as possible. We still have the opportunity to stay within the maximum increase of 1.5 degrees by the end of the century if we're able to reach the maximum point of emissions within 5 years and descend pretty quickly after, so that by the half of the century, by 2050, we are at a world that is carbon neutral. And carbon neutral means that we would not be emitting more greenhouse gases than the planet is able to naturally absorb. That zero net equation is the objective of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is very clear in the path that all countries will follow in order to get to that zero net balance. There's definitely a reality of a gap between those who have profited more from or benefited more from globalization and those that have benefited less. And that gap is certainly evident between nations as well as within nations. And I think what we are seeing now within nations is only another aspect of what we have known for a long time to be true between nations. So the famous North and South divide is also one of the outcomes, or at least has not been healed. The North-South divide has certainly not been healed in its entirety by globalization. So there is a reality there that is being reminded to everyone, and is a reality that it would be way too dangerous and not to our advantage to sweep under the carpet, but rather it's a reality that we have to embrace and we have to address. That doesn't mean that we don't continue to address global issues. Those are two separate issues. We have to continue to address global challenges, to address global issues, and global issues that are going to become increasingly complex, not just because of globalization, but also because we have reached planetary boundaries. So the interconnectedness that we see now among so many different factors is only going to increase. So we cannot reach the simplistic conclusion that because some people have truly been left behind, that therefore we don't address global issues. To the contrary, we then address global issues, bringing everyone on board.
you.